The letter had been folded so many times that the creases were worn nearly through, the paper soft as old cloth against Timothy Winslow's ankle, and he had not taken it out of his boot in 4 months because he was afraid that if he unfolded it one more time, it would fall apart entirely, and he could not afford to lose those words. He rode into the town of Caldwell, Kansas on a Thursday morning in the spring of 1878, his horse roan lathered from the last 3 miles of hard road, the dust of the Oklahoma Territory still coating his coat and his hat and the back of his neck. He was 26 years old and looked 32. The 2 years since he had last seen Winifred Slater had done that to him, stretched him out and weathered him the way the plains weathered everything, stripping away the softness and leaving only the essential. He had not planned to be gone 2 years. That was the truth he carried heavier than any saddlebag. He had planned to be gone 4 months. But the cattle drive that had started in Abilene had turned south into chaos when the trail boss took a fever and died at the Red River crossing, and the outfit had fractured, and Timothy had found himself driving cattle with men he barely trusted into country that had no patience for mistakes. Then the cattle had been stolen by a gang operating out of the Indian Territory, and they had spent 6 weeks chasing them down. And by the time that business was settled and Timothy had his pay in his pocket, it was November and the passes were not safe, and he had taken a job with a freight company out of Fort Worth because he needed to eat, and the winter had come down hard, and then spring had flooded the rivers, and then summer had brought drought and desperation, and another job that led to another. And each month had folded into the next the way that letter had folded into itself, smaller and smaller, carried closer and closer to his skin. He had written to Winifred. He had written 4 letters in 2 years, sent them through whatever post office would accept them, addressed to the Slater homestead outside the town of Millhaven, Nebraska, which sat in the rolling country north of the Platte River. He did not know if any of those letters had arrived. The mail in the territories was not a reliable institution, and he had seen his own letters lost, delayed, delivered to the wrong county, or simply eaten by the indifference of distance. But her letter had arrived. It had come to him at a rooming house in Dodge City in the autumn of 1877, forwarded through 3 different stops, crumpled and water-stained but intact, and he had read it standing in the street because he could not wait to get inside, and a man walking past had bumped his shoulder and he had not even looked up. Her handwriting was the kind that told you something about a person, careful but not stiff, each letter formed with intention. She had written that she was still at the homestead. She had written that her father's health had improved with the warmer months. She had written that she had turned down a proposal from a man named Garrett Albright who ran the feed store in Millhaven, and she had written this without ceremony, tucked between news of her mother's kitchen garden and the arrival of a new schoolteacher in town, as if it were a minor administrative note rather than the thing that had made Timothy Winslow stop breathing for a full 3 seconds. And then she had written, near the end, in handwriting that was slightly less careful than the rest, as if she had been pressing harder on the pen, "I will be here, Timothy. I am not going anywhere. You know where I am. I expect you have good reasons for being where you are, and I expect that when those reasons are settled, you will come. I will be here." He had put the letter in his boot the next morning. He had kept it there through the winter in Fort Worth, through a spring cattle drive up from San Antonio, through a summer of fence work in the Panhandle that had paid poorly and taken more out of him than it had given, through a desperate autumn where he had tracked down 2 stolen horses for a rancher outside Amarillo and been paid in cash and a hot meal, and the firm handshake of a man who told him he was worth more than he was charging. And now he was in Caldwell, Kansas, which was the last real town before the long road north to Nebraska, and he had enough money in his pocket to buy a train ticket from Wichita to Lincoln. And from Lincoln, it was a day's ride to Millhaven. And from Millhaven, it was another hour out to the Slater homestead. He had mapped it in his head so many times that the route felt more real than the ground under his feet. He watered Roan at the trough outside the livery and stood there in the early morning light, watching the town come awake. Caldwell was a cattle town at heart, the kind of place that had been born from the drives and would probably die when they stopped, but right now it was alive with commerce and noise, and the smell of livestock and coal smoke and frying meat. A woman in a green dress walked past carrying a basket of bread. A dog slept in the shade of the general store. Two men argued cheerfully outside the barber shop about the price of something. Timothy thought about Winifred Slater's face. He could see it clearly if he concentrated. Brown eyes that caught the light in a particular way, warm and direct, not the kind of eyes that looked away from things. Dark hair that she wore pinned up, but that came loose at the temples when she had been working, and she was always working. There was always something in her hands. She was 24 years old now, or would be in June, and he had missed 2 birthdays, and he intended to spend a significant amount of the rest of his life making up for that. He had met her 3 years ago, when he had come through Millhaven as part of a crew building a new bridge over Sawyer Creek for the county. She had brought water out to the men working in the afternoon heat, because her father's homestead was the closest property to the work site, and she had handed Timothy a tin cup and looked at him directly and said, without any particular preamble, that he was holding his hammer wrong and it was going to give him a blister in the web of his thumb. She had been right. He had liked her immediately and comprehensively. The courtship, if you could call it that, had happened over 3 weeks of bridge building. They had talked in the evenings, him on one side of the fence and her on the other, or walking along the creek, or sitting on the porch of the Slater house while her father pretended to read his newspaper, and her mother pretended not to watch from the window. He had told her about where he had been, and she had told him about where she had not been but intended to go someday, when the homestead was established enough that she could leave it to her parents for a stretch. When the bridge was finished and he had to move on, he had told her he would come back. He had said it plainly, not as a romantic flourish but as a statement of intention. She had said she would be there. She had said it the same way, plain and direct, and they had shaken hands like a business arrangement, and then she had laughed at herself for the handshake, and he had kissed her once briefly in the shadow of the new bridge. And then he had ridden away thinking that he would be back in 4 months and they would figure out what came next. The 4 months had become 2 years. He watered himself at the pump, washed his face and neck, looked at his reflection in a still water barrel, and decided he needed a shave before he went anywhere near Nebraska. He found the barber shop, submitted to the razor, and emerged feeling slightly more like a person and slightly less like a piece of driftwood. He ate breakfast at a small establishment run by a woman named Mrs. Donahue, who charged 40 cents for eggs and biscuits and coffee and did not make conversation, which he appreciated. He ate slowly, thinking about the road ahead. The plan was simple: ride to Wichita 2 days north, sell Roan to a good buyer because the horse needed rest and grain and care that he could not provide on the train, take the train to Lincoln, buy a new horse in Lincoln or rent one, ride to Millhaven. Ride to the Slater homestead, find Winifred, tell her. He was not entirely sure what he would tell her. He had composed speeches in his head at various points over the past 2 years, lying in his bedroll under the enormous sky, staring at stars that all seemed to point north. The speeches had ranged from elaborate and poetic to very simple. He had come around in the end to simple. He would tell her that he had been a fool to stay away so long. He would tell her that she was the thing he came back to in his head, the fixed point he navigated by. He would tell her that if she would have him, he would stay. He was done with the driving, done with the drifting, done with the kind of work that kept him moving and never let him land. He had $263 in his money belt, which was more than he had ever had at one time in his life. It was not a fortune, but it was a start. He finished his coffee and left a 5-cent tip under the cup and walked out into the Caldwell morning with his boot heel pressing against the folded letter, the way it always did, the way it had for 4 months, and he thought, tomorrow he would start north. He was crossing the main street toward the livery when he heard his name. Not his name exactly. He heard Winslow, which was close enough, and he turned to see a man striding toward him from the direction of the saloon, a broad man with a red beard and a walk like he owned the ground under him. It took Timothy a moment to place the face, and then he had it. Frank Doyle, who had been part of the San Antonio cattle drive the previous year. A good man, Frank, reliable and plain-spoken, though he had a temper that could get ahead of him. "Winslow," Frank said, reaching him and extending his hand. "I will be damned, heard you were up in the Panhandle." "Was," Timothy said, shaking his hand. "Heading north now." Frank's face changed slightly, the way a person's face changes when they know something you do not. "Nebraska." "That's right." Frank pulled at his beard. "You heard about the situation up north of the Platte." Timothy felt something cold move through him. "What situation?" "Drought hit hard last fall, worse this spring. Lot of homesteads in trouble." Frank looked at him steadily. "I came down from Wichita 10 days ago with a crew. We were moving some cattle up from the territory. We stopped in a town called Millhaven." "I know Millhaven. There was some trouble there. Not violent trouble, but the kind that could become it. Seems a land company out of Chicago has been buying up properties from families that are behind on their notes. Moving fast, buying cheap, pushing hard." Frank paused. "Man named Albright, runs a feed store. He's involved with the company somehow, acting as their local agent." Timothy thought of the name Garrett Albright in Winifred's letter, offered a proposal of marriage she had declined, and the cold thing inside him became something sharper. "What properties?" he said, keeping his voice level. Frank looked at him for a moment. "I don't know every name, but a homestead north of town, family named Slater, they were mentioned. There was talk in the saloon. Father's been ill, apparently. Notes on the property, and Albright has been making it difficult for them." Timothy did not say anything. He was already calculating. "You know them," Frank said. It was not a question. "Yes," Timothy said. Frank nodded slowly. "Train from Wichita to Lincoln runs twice a week. There's one leaving Wichita the day after tomorrow. I'll make Wichita by tonight if I push Roan." "He's a good horse," Frank said. "He'll hold." Timothy thanked him, shook his hand again, and walked to the livery at a pace that was not quite running but not quite not running either. He pushed Roan hard that day, stopping twice to water him at the creek crossings, eating in the saddle, the flat Kansas land rolling past on both sides, the sky enormous and pale blue overhead. The spring had come in reluctantly and the grass was still thin, and the wind came from the south carrying the smell of distance. He had ridden this kind of road before, urgent but aimless, chasing cattle or avoiding weather or simply moving because standing still cost money. This was different. This was the opposite of aimless. He reached Wichita as the sun was going down, the cattle pens on the south end of town creating their familiar noise and smell, the streets busy with the end-of-day commerce of a cattle market town. He found a good buyer for Roan within an hour, a rancher named Colquitt who had 2 young daughters and a gentle manner with animals, and Timothy sold Roan for a fair price and felt genuinely sorry about it because Roan had been a good horse and had earned better than being sold in a twilight transaction in Wichita. He bought his train ticket. He found a boarding house for one night, a clean place with a feather bed that felt dangerously soft after 2 years of bedrolls. He lay on top of the covers in his trail clothes and took out the letter. The paper was soft as chamois and the creases were deep, but the words were intact, every one of them. The ink faded but legible, and he read them in the lamplight the way he had read them perhaps 100 times, slowly, paying attention. She had written about the garden, about her mother's recipe for green tomato preserves, about a foal born on the south pasture, about her father's improving health, which had apparently reversed again given what Frank Doyle had told him, about Garrett Albright's proposal, delivered in the feed store with what she described with barely concealed amusement as considerable confidence in its reception, about the new schoolteacher, a young woman from Ohio who was doing good work with the children. And then the last lines, the ones that had been pressed into his memory past the point of needing to read them. "I will be here, Timothy. I am not going anywhere. You know where I am. I expect you have good reasons for being where you are, and I expect that when those reasons are settled, you will come. I will be here." He folded the letter back along its worn creases and returned it to his boot. He slept better than he had in months. The train north was a locomotive and 4 cars, coal smoke and the smell of hot metal and the constant motion of the tracks beneath him. And Timothy sat in the second car watching Kansas give way to Nebraska, the land flattening further and then beginning to roll again, the grasses longer and greener as they moved north, the sky somehow even bigger, if that was possible. He ate the sandwiches he had bought at the Wichita station and drank water from his canteen and watched a farming family across the aisle, a man and his wife and 3 children, the smallest asleep against the mother's shoulder with his mouth slightly open. The father was talking quietly to the oldest child about something, showing him something on a piece of paper, and the child was leaning in with the focused attention of someone learning something they understood to be important. Timothy looked away and out the window. He thought about what Frank Doyle had said. A land company from Chicago using a local agent to press families off their properties when they were vulnerable. It was not an unusual story in 1878. The great land consolidation was well underway, the railroads and the companies that followed them eating up the small claims, and the law was not always on the side of the individual homesteader. And sometimes the men running the process were careful enough about the legal forms that there was no recourse. But sometimes they were not careful. Sometimes they were simply counting on the isolated farmer not knowing what his rights were, or not having the money or the energy or the connection to contest it. He did not know yet what the situation was with the Slater homestead specifically. He would have to find out before he could know what, if anything, could be done. And it was possible that by the time he arrived, the situation had resolved itself, or worsened past resolving, or taken a direction entirely different from what Frank Doyle had observed from a saloon in Millhaven 10 days ago. But he would not sit on this train and assume the best. He had been assuming things would work out on their own for 2 years. Lincoln was the end of the line, a proper city by Nebraska standards, with stone buildings and brick streets in the center and wooden construction spreading outward in every direction, the young capital of a young state doing its best to look established. He arrived in the late afternoon, found a livery and bought a horse, a steady bay mare named, according to the livery owner who seemed to find it important to convey this information. Pearl was 8 years old, not flashy but solid, with good feet and a calm disposition and enough power in her hindquarters to handle the road north. He bought grain for the road. He bought a fresh canteen. He bought a new pair of socks because the ones on his feet had worn through, and he was developing a blister on his left heel near where the letter sat. He rode out of Lincoln the next morning before dawn, heading north on the road that followed the Platte River drainage, the country opening up around him into the wide Nebraska morning, dew on the grass, meadowlarks calling from the fence posts, the sky going from purple to rose to gold as the sun came up in his right eye. He rode steadily, not pushing Pearl, who was fresh and wanted to move but whom he would need for the full day. He passed farmsteads in various states of establishment, some flourishing with new buildings and well-kept fences, some struggling and apparent in their struggle, leaning structures and untended land, and the particular silence of a place where hope has become difficult. The land was beautiful regardless. That was something about Nebraska he had thought about in the 2 years away, not the hardship of it but the beauty, the way the grass moved in wind like something breathing, the way the clouds stacked up in the afternoons, the way the rivers ran clear and cold in the bends. He had been born in Ohio and had come west at 19 looking for something he had not been able to name, and he had found work and movement and skill in the work, but Nebraska was the first place that had made him think about staying. That had been Winifred's doing mostly, but not only. He reached Millhaven in the late afternoon of the second day, having camped one night beside the Platte at a spot where a cottonwood had fallen across the bank and made a good windbreak. Millhaven was not large. It had a main street of perhaps 10 buildings, the feed store and the dry goods store and the post office, and the saloon and the barber shop, and the church and the schoolhouse, and 2 or 3 other establishments, and then residential properties spreading out behind and around these, and then the farms and homesteads beginning a quarter-mile out in every direction. He rode to the post office first, because it was the most neutral establishment for gathering information. The postmaster was a small man named Hatch, with spectacles and a precise manner, who seemed to know everything that happened in the county by virtue of handling its correspondence. Timothy introduced himself and said he was looking for the Slater family, friends of his, and that he had been away some time and wanted to know how they were getting on before he rode out there. Hatch looked at him over the spectacles for a moment. "You're the one who built the bridge," he said. "Part of the crew that did, yes." Hatch nodded slowly. "They're still there. Mr. Slater has been poorly for going on a year now, some kind of lung trouble. Mrs. Slater runs the place with Miss Winifred." He paused, and his expression did something careful. "There's been some difficulty with the property note. The note holder sold the debt some months back to a company, and the company's been pressing for payment or sale." "What company?" "Called itself the Western Land and Settlement Company, out of Chicago." Hatch said it with the particular distaste of a man who had seen the paperwork and did not like what it represented. "They have a local arrangement with Mr. Albright. I know the name. Most people do." Hatch straightened some papers on his counter. "Miss Winifred has been fighting it. She went to the county seat twice, once in the winter and once last month. I believe she found a solicitor of sorts who has been writing letters. Whether that amounts to anything remains to be seen." He looked at Timothy steadily. "She could use some help." "I know," Timothy said. "I should have been here sooner." He rode out of Millhaven on the North Road, Pearl moving at a steady walk through the late afternoon light, the sun dropping toward the western horizon and painting the grassland in long gold bars. The road climbed slightly and then descended toward the creek drainage where the Slater homestead sat, and Timothy felt his pulse doing something it had not done in 2 years, or perhaps in his whole life exactly like this. He was almost there. He rounded the last curve in the road and saw the homestead across the creek, the farmhouse white with a front porch, the barn red and substantial, 2 fields visible from the road, one planted and one plowed and ready, and a kitchen garden along the south side of the house that was the most carefully tended thing he could see from here, laid out in rows with the precise attention of someone who cared about it. There was a woman working in the garden. He could see her from the road, her back to him, bending and straightening, wearing a dark blue dress and a wide-brimmed hat, and even from this distance he would have known her anywhere. He stopped Pearl at the gate and got down. He opened the gate, and it swung smoothly on new hinges that had not been there 3 years ago. He led Pearl through and latched the gate behind him, and he walked across the yard toward the garden, and his boot heels made sound on the packed earth, and Winifred Slater straightened and turned. She looked at him. He looked at her. 2 years of plains wind and hard work had not diminished her in any way he had feared. She was exactly as he remembered, and also not, because memory is a rough tool. It catches the outlines but loses the specific quality of a person in life. The way the light moves in her eyes, the particular line of her jaw, the precise expression she was wearing now, which was something he could not quite read from 10 feet away. He stopped. "Miss Slater," he said, which was not what he had intended to say. "Mr. Winslow," she said, which was not what he had expected to hear. They looked at each other for another moment. Then something shifted in her face, not breaking open exactly, but unlocking the way a door unlocks, and she said, "You are here," and her voice was completely level, and she was gripping the trowel she was holding quite hard. "I'm here," he said. "I'm sorry it took this long." She looked at him for a long time. Then she set the trowel carefully on the edge of the garden bed and pulled off her work gloves and said, "Come inside. I'll put the kettle on. I believe we have a considerable amount to talk about." He tied Pearl at the hitching post beside the barn, and he followed Winifred into the house. The interior of the Slater farmhouse was exactly as he remembered, modest and clean and arranged with care. The front room had a settee and 2 chairs around a fireplace, a braided rug on the floor, a bookshelf with perhaps 20 volumes, curtains at the windows that were faded but freshly washed. The kitchen was through an open doorway, a large iron stove, a good table, shelves of preserves and dried goods. Winifred's mother, Margaret Slater, was sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of mending when they came in. She was a woman in her 50s with Winifred's directness in her eyes and the additional quality of having survived a great deal without being broken by it. She looked at Timothy with an expression that was not quite welcome and not quite accusation, but something carefully positioned between them. "Mrs. Slater," Timothy said, "it's good to see you." "Mr. Winslow," she said, "you've been some time." "I have," he said. "I know." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then she looked at her daughter, and something passed between them that he could not decode. Then Margaret Slater returned to her mending and said, "There are cups in the top cupboard." Winifred made tea. She made it with the focused efficiency of someone who does things properly regardless of the circumstances, and she put 2 cups on the table and sat across from Timothy and looked at him and said, "Tell me." So he told her. He told her the whole of it, starting from where he had last left her and working forward through every month, not skipping the bad decisions or the places where he had lost time to work that was beneath him, or the months in the panhandle that he could not fully account for in terms of what he had been thinking. He told it straight, with the honesty of a man who knows he has something to answer for and is not going to try to argue his way out of it. She listened without interrupting. Her hands were around her cup and she watched him steadily throughout, and he could not tell what she was thinking until he reached the letter, the one she had sent him in Dodge City, and he said, "I have read it I cannot tell you how many times," and he reached into his boot and took it out and set it on the table between them. She looked at it. She looked at the worn paper, the deep-pressed creases, the condition of something that had been handled constantly for months and months. She picked it up and held it, feeling the weight of the paper, and when she looked at him again, the expression on her face had changed entirely into something that made his chest tight. "You kept it in your boot," she said. "I didn't want to lose it." She was quiet for a moment. "I wrote 4 letters to you after that one. None of them found you, I suppose." "I didn't get them. I'm sorry." She set the letter down carefully between them on the table. "I want you to know that I was not angry, Timothy. I was worried in the beginning, and then I was worried in a different way, and then I was simply—" She stopped and seemed to choose her next words. "I was waiting, not passively. I was living and working and managing this place, but inside of that I was waiting for you to come back the way I said I would be." "I know," he said. "You told me you would be here. I held on to that." "I can see that you did," she said, looking at the letter. The late afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them. Margaret Slater continued her mending in the background with the tremendous tact of a woman who understood exactly what was happening at her kitchen table and intended to let it happen without interference. "There's something I need to tell you about as well," Winifred said, after a moment. "The homestead." "I heard some of it in Millhaven," he said. "The land company, Albright." Something hardened slightly in her eyes. "Garrett Albright offered to buy the note from us last fall. Directly to me, not to my parents, and not in the feed store this time. He came to the house. He said the company he represented would clear the debt and take the property title, and that he could make it very easy for us." She paused. "He implied that the difficulty could also become very easy in the other direction if I were not cooperative." Timothy kept his expression still and his hands flat on the table. "What did you say to him?" "I told him to get off my family's property." She said it simply. "I went to the county seat the next week and found a solicitor, a man named Harold Cutter who practices in Columbus, and I have been corresponding with him about the legality of the debt sale. The original mortgage was with a bank in Omaha. The bank sold it without proper notification to us, which Mr. Cutter believes may give us grounds to contest the assignment." Timothy looked at her with something he could only describe as profound admiration. "Have you heard from Cutter recently?" he said. "I have a letter here from him, arrived last week. He says there may be a hearing before the county judge." She reached to the shelf behind her and brought out a folded letter. "He says the company has been applying pressure at the county seat as well, and that he is not certain the judge is neutral." Timothy read the letter carefully. Harold Cutter wrote with the cautious precision of a lawyer who understood his limitations, but he also wrote with a genuine anger about what the company was doing that showed through the professional language, and that was a good sign. He had identified 3 specific procedural defects in the debt assignment, any one of which might be enough to have it invalidated if presented properly before a court that was doing its job. "The problem is," Winifred said, watching him read, "that Mr. Cutter's fees have already been more than we can comfortably afford, and if the hearing requires him to travel to the county seat and argue before the judge, the cost will be considerable. And my father—" She stopped. "How is your father?" Timothy said carefully. She looked at her hands. "Not well. He has good days, but he is not able to work, and he has not been for some months now. My mother and I have been managing, and we have managed. We have kept the crops going and the animals healthy and the house in order, but we cannot also fight a legal battle with a Chicago land company and pay a solicitor at the same time." She looked up. "I did not write to you about it. I thought about writing, but I did not want you to come back because of a crisis. I wanted you to come back because you wanted to." He looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had been fighting on multiple fronts for months and had deliberately chosen not to call for help because she wanted the help when it came to be genuine. "I want to," he said. "I want to very much, and I would also like, if you will allow it, to help with the other thing. I have money. Not a fortune, but enough to pay Cutter properly and keep something left over." "Timothy, let me say what I want to say," he said. "I have been composing it for about a year and a half, so I would rather get through it." He took a breath. "I have been wrong to stay away so long. I know that. I won't pretend the reasons weren't real because they were, but I let the reasons stack up and become an excuse, and that was my error and I own it. When I got your letter, I understood very clearly what I had been too slow to admit to myself, which is that you are the most important thing to me, and that the work and the road and all of it meant nothing without the intention of coming back to you. I have $263 and a bay mare and the skills to earn more, and I want to put all of it toward building something here with you, if you are willing." She was very still across the table from him. "I have not changed my mind," she said. Her voice was quiet but entirely steady. "I told you I would be here, and I am here, and I have not changed my mind once in 2 years. I want you to know that when I told Garrett Albright to get off this property, I was not thinking about the legal merits of his offer." Something like a smile moved at the corner of her mouth. "I was thinking about a man who had folded my letter small enough to carry in his boot." "You couldn't have known I was doing that," he said. "I knew you would treat it carefully," she said. "I knew you when I wrote it." He stood up from the table, and she stood up at the same moment, as if the decision had been made at the same level beneath words, and he crossed the 2 steps between them, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, feeling the new shave, feeling the shape of his face, and he put his hands on her shoulders very carefully, as if she were made of something he valued enormously, which she was. "Winifred," he said. "Yes," she said, and she was smiling now properly, the full weight of it, and it was exactly as he remembered and better than he remembered. And he bent his head and kissed her, and she kissed him back with the accumulated warmth of 2 years of waiting, transformed into something immediate and certain. And from the other room Margaret Slater made a sound that might have been clearing her throat, or might have been something else entirely. When they separated, Timothy rested his forehead against hers and she had her hands on his chest, and they stood like that for a moment. "Your mother," he said. "She will be very pleased," Winifred said. "Has been rather worried, and I think she will be much less worried now." He did meet her father that evening. Edwin Slater was in his bedroom, propped against pillows, a man who had been large and strong and had been diminished by illness but not in his eyes, which were sharp and assessing, and Timothy noticed extremely similar to his daughter's. Edwin shook his hand firmly, the grip weaker than it would have been but the intention behind it clear. "I know who you are," Edwin said. "Winifred has spoken of you." "I hope well," Timothy said. "Some of it well," Edwin said. "Some of it with the kind of frustration that tells you someone matters more than they might prefer to admit." He held Timothy's eye. "You're back. I'm back. For good. If you'll have me," Timothy said. "Yes, for good." Edwin looked at him for what felt like a very long time, and then he released Timothy's hand and settled back slightly and said, "Good. The south fence needs mending and I cannot do it myself." Timothy smiled. "I'll start in the morning." He slept that night in the small room off the barn that had been a hired hand's quarters, before the Slaters' hired man had moved on to work for a large ranch operation the previous year. It was clean, and had a wood stove and a narrow bed and a window that looked out toward the garden. He lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about everything that had to happen. The legal situation, the money, the fence, all of it was manageable, all of it had solutions. He had $263 and a skill set built over 2 years of doing essentially everything a man could do in the Great West. And he had Winifred Slater, who was the kind of person who went to the county seat twice on her own, and found a solicitor and wrote letters while simultaneously running a farm and caring for an ill father, and he thought that together, they were more than adequate to what was in front of them. He felt something he had not felt in 2 years, and maybe longer. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. In the morning, he started on the fence. He worked for 3 days straight on the south fence, replacing posts that had heaved in the winter freeze and restretching wire, and doing it properly, the way it should have been done the first time by whoever had put it up. And on the second afternoon, Winifred came out with water and sat on the fence rail and watched him work, and they talked for 2 hours about everything. The kind of conversation that is really many conversations compressed into one, catching up, filling the gaps, learning the person again after time. She told him about the 2 previous winters, the first one hard but manageable, the second one brutal, a blizzard in January that had buried the barn doors and killed 2 of their cattle. She told him about her father's illness, which had started as what seemed like an ordinary winter cough, and had become something deeper and more persistent that the doctor in Millhaven had called a lung inflammation, and treated with limited success. She told him about Garrett Albright's escalation, how he had progressed from courtship to business proposition to something that felt, by the time of the visit to the house, more like pressure than proposal. Timothy told her about the drives, the good and the bad of them. He told her about a sunrise over the Llano Estacado that had been the most purely beautiful thing he had seen in 2 years, until now. He told her about the mare Pearl, whom he had left in the barn, and who appeared to be getting along well with the Slaters' horses in the way that horses did when they had decided each other was acceptable. He told her about the letter and exactly when and where he had received it and what it had meant to him every time he read it. She listened to all of it and sometimes laughed at parts he had not quite intended as funny, but it was her laugh that he had been missing without quite knowing it, the quick, genuine kind that happened when something genuinely struck her, not the polite kind that people produced on schedule. On the 4th day, Timothy rode into Millhaven. He needed to send a letter to Harold Cutter confirming his interest in supporting the legal action and asking for an accounting of what was owed and what was needed going forward. He also wanted to see the town with fresh eyes, understand its character, understand what kind of operation Albright was running and how deep his roots were. He sent the letter first, paying for express delivery through the post office, where Hatch received it with the unruffled efficiency of a man who had seen many important-looking envelopes in his time. Then he went to the feed store. Garrett Albright was a man in his early 30s, well-dressed by the standards of a Nebraska feed store, with a broad face and the look of someone who was accustomed to getting what he wanted without too much difficulty. He looked at Timothy with the assessing gaze of a man who made it his business to know everyone in a 20-mile radius and was encountering someone he did not recognize. Passing through, Albright said. "No," Timothy said. "I'm working the Slater homestead north of town. You'd be familiar with it." Albright's expression became carefully neutral. "I know the property, yes." "Good," Timothy said. "I wanted to introduce myself since I understand you've had some dealings with the family. Timothy Winslow." He held out his hand. Albright shook it after a beat. "They're behind on a note." "They're contesting the assignment of that note," Timothy said pleasantly. "I believe they have a solicitor on it, Harold Cutter out of Columbus. Good man from what I understand. Thorough." Albright said nothing, but something moved in his eyes. "I just thought it would be neighborly to introduce myself," Timothy said. "Since I'll be around." He bought a sack of oats for Pearl and left. It was not a confrontation. It was a statement of presence, which he had calculated was more useful at this stage. Albright needed to understand that the Slater homestead was no longer a vulnerable, isolated target, that there was now someone there who knew the name Harold Cutter and was comfortable walking into a feed store and saying it. That kind of information changed calculations. He rode back to the homestead in good spirits, the oats across Pearl's withers, the spring air doing what spring air did in Nebraska when it was being cooperative, filling the world with green and the smell of turned earth and the distant calling of birds. Winifred was at the kitchen table when he got back, writing a letter. She looked up when he came in, and he told her about the visit to Albright, and she considered it, and then said that it was probably useful but that she wished he had consulted her first. He recognized the justice of this. "You're right," he said. "I should have. I'm sorry, I acted on instinct." She looked at him for a moment. "Tell me next time." "I will." "Good," she said, and returned to her letter. And he went attend to Pearl, and he thought that this was what it was going to be like, which was honest and direct and occasionally involving apologies, and he found that he was entirely comfortable with that. Cutter's response arrived 8 days later. He had received Timothy's letter and was preparing for the county court hearing, which had been set for the 15th of May, and he estimated his fees through the hearing at $45 and asked for $30 in advance. He outlined the 3 procedural grounds for contest with more confidence than his previous letter had shown, and he mentioned that he had found a second precedent from an Iowa district court that supported the position that debt assignment without proper notice to the mortgagor was invalid under Nebraska statute. Timothy sent the $30 to Cutter that afternoon and wrote back confirming the support through the hearing. He told Winifred at supper. She read Cutter's letter with the focused attention she brought to everything and set it down on the table with something like relief, genuine and unguarded, the kind she did not often permit herself. "Thank you," she said. "It's a good case," Timothy said. "Cutter knows what he's doing." "I've thought so," Winifred said. "I was worried about the cost of the hearing, but with this," she stopped. "I didn't want to ask you for money, Timothy. I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said. "I didn't bring it out here to be asked for. I'm bringing it because it's the right thing to do with it." Margaret Slater, who was serving the food with the composed manner of a woman who was watching 2 people navigate the early stages of a partnership, said, "He sounds like his word is good, Winifred," and then sat down and said grace, and that was the end of the subject. The days fell into a rhythm. Timothy worked the farm each morning, doing the things that Edwin Slater could not do, and the things that Winifred and her mother had been doing alone, and there was a great deal of it, the deferred maintenance of a place where the labor had been short for a year. He repaired the barn roof where a winter storm had lifted 3 boards. He dug out the irrigation ditch along the east field that had silted in over the winter. He turned the second field for the late planting of winter squash and beans. He fixed the kitchen garden's rabbit fence, which had a gap in the northeast corner that something was using with regularity, and Winifred was too busy to hunt down. In the afternoons, after the heaviest work was done, he and Winifred worked together, and those hours were the ones he would carry with him the longest. There was something in working beside someone, the communication that happened without words, the adjustment and accommodation and the shared understanding of a task, that told you more about a person than conversation did. He learned that she was stronger than she looked, which he had suspected. He learned that she had opinions about the right way to do nearly everything, which he had also suspected, and that approximately 70% of the time she was correct, which was a higher percentage than most people, himself included. He learned that when she was tired and had been doing something difficult for a long time, she grew quieter rather than shorter, which was the reverse of what he might have expected. He also learned, in the evenings when they sat on the porch and talked in the last of the light, with the meadowlarks doing their evening work in the grass and the fireflies beginning to appear over the creek, that she had been doing more than waiting. She had been thinking, she told him, about what she wanted, not just in terms of the homestead and the immediate crisis, but beyond it. She had ideas about the farm that went further than her parents' original plan. A larger kitchen garden that supplied not just the family but perhaps sold produce to the town. A better managed breeding program for the cattle. A long-term investment in the soil quality that would take years to pay off but would make the land genuinely productive rather than subsistence productive. She laid these ideas out with the precision of someone who had been thinking about them for a long time, testing them against reality, revising them, and was now presenting the version that had survived that process. He listened to all of it and asked questions, not challenging questions but genuine ones, and she answered them and sometimes said, "I don't know yet," which he found more reassuring than if she had had an answer to everything. He offered his own ideas where they seemed useful, and she considered them with the same care she brought to everything, and by the time the fireflies were thick over the creek and the temperature had dropped to comfortable, they had the outline of something that felt less like a plan and more like a shared vision. "You've been running this place in your head for a long time," he said. "I've had time to think," she said dryly. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I want you to know I have thought about this, and I am not saying it because of the situation with the note or anything about the practical circumstances." She turned to look at him in the dusk, her face in profile against the last of the western light. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you since I was on one side of a fence and you were telling me I was holding a hammer wrong, and I have spent 2 years away from here understanding how much that meant and intending to come back and tell you so. I should have said it before I left. I should have said it in the letter I wrote from Abilene. I am saying it now." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I have known for a while." "Then say it back," he said, "because I would like to hear it." She turned fully toward him, and in the last light he could see the expression on her face, which was the one he had been trying to reconstruct from memory for 2 years, the specific combination of warmth and directness and something tender that she did not show casually. "I love you, Timothy Winslow," she said. "I have been in love with you since the day you took my advice about the hammer and did not make it into a larger thing than it needed to be, which told me you were the kind of man who could receive information without his pride getting in the way." He laughed, and she laughed, and he reached over and took her hand and they sat on the porch while the dark came down around the homestead, and the creek spoke its night language and somewhere in the distance a whip-poor-will called in the deep grass. He had been here for 3 weeks. He had not gone anywhere. He did not intend to. The hearing before the county judge was on the 15th of May, and Winifred rode to Columbus with Harold Cutter, who had come to Millhaven the day before and stayed the night at the boarding house. Timothy would have gone, but Winifred made the decision that she and Cutter presenting the case was cleaner and more focused than a larger delegation, and Timothy accepted this, partly because she was probably right and partly because he understood that this was her fight in a particular way, her name on the case, her family's property, and it was important that she stand at the front of it. He spent that day doing hard physical work because it was the only thing that kept his mind from cycling. He cleared brush along the creek bank where the spring flooding had deposited debris, working with an axe in his hands, the wood chips flying, the smell of fresh-cut cottonwood sharp in the air. Edwin Slater sat in a chair on the porch that day, having a better-than-average day, and watched the creek for a while and then called Timothy over, and they talked for an hour about the history of the homestead. How Edwin had come to Nebraska in 1866 from Pennsylvania with Margaret, and the first year had nearly destroyed them, and the second year had been when they understood the land and began to work with it rather than against it. Edwin told these stories with the satisfaction of a man reviewing good work, but also with a sadness that was not quite about his illness. It was about the accumulation of what he might not be able to continue. "I'm not going to recover," Edwin said at one point, simply and without drama. Timothy was quiet for a moment. "Winifred doesn't say that. Winifred is optimistic," Edwin said. "It's her good quality and her difficult one. I am also optimistic in the ordinary sense, but I am also realistic." He looked out toward the creek. "What I need to know is that she will have help, not just on the farm, the kind of help that comes from having someone beside you who is yours and whom you are." "I intend to propose to her," Timothy said. "I wanted to tell you that directly because I thought you deserved to hear it directly." Edwin looked at him with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Good," he said. "I'd have proposed on your behalf if you'd waited much longer." Timothy smiled. "I'm sorry it took me this long to get here." "You're here now," Edwin said. "That's what matters. The past is past. A man can do whatever he wants with the future." He paused. "She's strong, but she doesn't have to do it all alone. That's what she's needed, not someone to do it for her, someone to do it with her." "I know," Timothy said. "I know exactly." Winifred returned from Columbus the following evening, arriving in the yard as the sun was going down, and she got off her horse and walked to where Timothy was standing on the porch, and she said, "We won." He felt something loosen in his chest that he had not been entirely aware was tight. "Tell me," he said. "Cutter argued all 3 procedural grounds," she said, the words coming quickly, the emotion she had been controlling all day beginning to surface now that she was home. "The judge agreed on the first and second. He said the assignment of the note was invalid under Nebraska statute because the bank had not provided proper written notice to us as mortgagors before the sale. The assignment is voided. The debt reverts to the original bank note in Omaha, which has different terms and a different timeline." She stopped. "The Western Land and Settlement Company has no claim on this property. And Albright, he was there with a lawyer of his own," she said. "A very expensive-looking lawyer who was not, in the end, as thorough as Cutter." Something like satisfaction moved in her expression. He did not look pleased. "I imagine he didn't." "I don't particularly care," she said, and the edge in her voice on those words was not anger exactly, but the particular sharpness of someone who has been under pressure for a long time and has just had the pressure released. "He made this very difficult for my family, and he did it deliberately, and he compounded a genuine hardship that my father's illness had already created, and I have no sympathy for him whatsoever." "You don't need to," Timothy said. She stood in the yard for a moment, letting the evening air do what it did, the last of the day's warmth coming out of the ground, the fireflies starting their first tentative performances over the grass. Then she put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying, just breathing, and when she took her hands away she was herself again, steady and present. "Thank you for this," she said quietly. "For Cutter and for being here and for being—" She stopped. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She looked at him, and he thought it was possible that she understood what he meant by that, the full weight of it, the echo of her own words reflected back. "Good," she said. He proposed on a Sunday morning in late May, which had nothing particular to recommend it as a date except that it was warm and the garden was blooming, and they were alone in the kitchen after breakfast, because Margaret had taken Edwin for a brief walk along the creek in the bright air, which was a good day for him, one of the better ones, and it seemed like the right Sunday in a way he could not entirely explain. He had not rehearsed it, which was a departure from his earlier practice of rehearsing speeches. The spoken versions never matched the rehearsed ones anyway, and he had come to believe that what mattered was not the construction of the words but the truth behind them. He said, "Winifred, I would like to marry you. I want to stay here on this land and work it with you and be the person beside you for whatever comes, the good things and the difficult things and the everyday things. I think we are good together. I think we are better together than either of us is separately. I think you know that too." She had been drying a cup when he started, and she put the cup down and the towel down and turned to look at him. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He had bought a ring in Columbus, a simple gold band with a small set stone that the jeweler there had described as a garnet, deep red and clear, and which he had been carrying in his inside coat pocket since the day after Winifred came home from the hearing. He took it out now and she held out her hand, and he put it on her finger and it fit, which felt like either a coincidence or something more. She looked at it on her hand for a moment. "It's beautiful," she said, and looked up at him. And then he kissed her in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the sounds of the farm around them and the smell of coffee still in the air. And it was the best moment of his life to that point, uncomplicated and entire. When Margaret and Edwin came back from the creek 20 minutes later, Winifred met them in the yard and held out her hand. Margaret's face did the thing that faces do when something has been hoped for a long time and has finally arrived. And she put both hands around Winifred's and pressed them and looked at Timothy with an expression that had become, unambiguously, welcome. Edwin shook Timothy's hand and said, "About time," and then had to sit down because the walk had tired him, but he was smiling when he sat down, genuinely and without qualification. They were married in June, on the first Saturday, in the church in Millhaven. The minister was a man named Reverend Brooks who had been in the town for 5 years and knew the Slater family well and brought genuine feeling to the ceremony. The congregation was not large. Millhaven was not a large town, but it was full, and Hatch from the post office was there, and the woman from the dry goods store, and several families from the farms around the Slater homestead who had known Winifred her whole life, and who greeted Timothy with the assessing warmth of people who have decided to extend trust on someone else's recommendation and are paying attention to whether it will be honored. Winifred wore a dress that Margaret had helped her make from fabric she had been saving for a year, blue-gray silk that had come from a dry goods store in Columbus, and she wore her hair pinned up with small white flowers tucked into it, and she walked into the church on her father's arm, Edwin slow and careful, but upright and proud, and Timothy stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle, and thought that nothing in the next 50 years was going to surpass this specific moment. He was wrong about that, as it turned out, but it would take time to know it. After the ceremony, they went back to the homestead, where Margaret had prepared more food than seemed possible for one woman to have made, and neighbors brought more. And there was a fiddle player from the South Road named Clement who could play anything and did. And they danced in the yard as the evening came on, and Edwin watched from his chair on the porch and tapped his foot to the music with his eyes bright. And Margaret danced with Clement's brother who had come along to turn the pages. And the fireflies rose above the creek, and the sky went from gold to rose to deep violet to the blue-black of a Nebraska summer night full of stars. Timothy danced with Winifred until they were both tired, and then they stood at the edge of the yard in the dark with the music still going behind them, and she leaned against him and he had his arms around her, and they looked out toward the creek and the stars, and she said quietly, "We did it." "We did," he said. "All of it," she said. "The legal business, the fence, the farm, you, me. All of it," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, comfortable in the way that people are comfortable when they have stopped performing and are simply present. "I wrote that letter," she said, "and I meant every word of it, but I want you to know that I was not entirely without doubt. Some nights I was very much without certainty." "I know," he said. "I should have made it easier for you. I should have come sooner. You came when you came," she said, "and I was here when you came. That's how it happened." He thought about the letter in his boot, all those miles, all those months. "I carried it everywhere," he said. "I know," she said. That tells me everything I need to know. The summer was the best Timothy could remember. He was happy in a way that did not announce itself constantly, but was simply present, underlying everything, the way the deep water is present under the surface current. The farm work was hard but satisfying in the way that work is satisfying when it has meaning beyond the task itself, when the corn in the east field is not just corn but proof of something, when the cattle in the south pasture are not just cattle but the evidence of continuity. He and Winifred worked together with the efficiency of people who are learning each other, making adjustments, finding the rhythm. He wrote to his older brother in Ohio, whom he had not been in close contact with for several years, a letter that said he had married and was farming in Nebraska, and was, for the first time in his adult life, entirely where he wanted to be. His brother wrote back with news of the family and congratulations, and the mild bewilderment of a settled man regarding a brother who had spent 6 years wandering. Timothy read the letter at the kitchen table and smiled and wrote back. Edwin Slater's health declined through the summer, gradually and without drama, the way that some illnesses progress when they have made up their mind about their direction. He had good days and worse days, and he was always himself, always present and thinking clearly, but the energy diminished. He sat more and slept more, and the walks along the creek became too tiring, and by September he was spending most of his time in his room, though he still insisted on being brought to the table for the evening meal when he was able. He and Timothy talked a great deal through that summer and into the fall, conversations that covered the full range of things, the history of the homestead and Edwin's years in Pennsylvania before it, the nature of the land and its demands, books that Edwin had read and Timothy had not, politics at the state level which neither of them cared for but both found interesting, the stories of both their fathers, one of whom had been a minister and one of whom had been a carpenter, and the different things those childhoods had produced. Timothy learned from Edwin Slater the way he had always learned best, not from instruction but from proximity, listening to the way a man thought about things and absorbing the quality of the thinking. Edwin was not a man who spoke without consideration, and what he said was worth remembering, and Timothy remembered it. In October, Winifred told Timothy she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before the day's work had started, matter-of-factly but with a brightness in her eyes that was not her ordinary brightness, something warmer and more private. He was standing at the stove with a coffee cup and she was sitting at the table and she said, "I believe we are going to have a child in the spring." And he put the coffee cup down very carefully and looked at her and said, "Are you certain?" And she said, "I am certain enough." And he crossed the kitchen and picked her up and she made a sound of surprised laughter and said, "Timothy, put me down." And he put her down and held her face in both his hands and said, "That is the best thing I have heard in a very long time." And she was still laughing but also, he noticed, holding onto the front of his shirt with both hands. He went to tell Edwin that afternoon. He went into the bedroom and sat in the chair by the bed and told him, and Edwin was quiet for a moment and then he said, "A grandchild," with a satisfaction that went very deep, and he reached out and gripped Timothy's wrist. "I am glad," he said. "I am very glad." "So are we," Timothy said. He told Margaret at supper, though he suspected Winifred had already told her, and Margaret's face confirmed this suspicion. But she listened to the announcement with the grace of someone receiving it properly, and said that she had wondered, and that she was pleased, and that Winifred's grandmother had delivered 3 children in February, and they had all been strong and healthy, which was the practical reassurance of a practical woman. Edwin Slater died in December, on a cold Thursday morning with snow on the ground, quietly and without apparent distress, in his own bed with Margaret holding his hand. He had been declining since October and they had known it was close, but the knowing never entirely prepares you. Winifred sat with her mother for a long time that day, and Timothy did what needed to be done, the immediate practical things that present themselves at such times, and in the evening he sat with both women at the kitchen table and they talked about Edwin, the years of him, the character of him, the specific quality of a man who had brought his family to an unbroken land and built something there through will and work and love. The grief was real, and Timothy did not try to shorten it. He made himself available without being intrusive, worked harder at the physical tasks so that Winifred and Margaret could have more time with each other and with their mourning. He rode to Millhaven to make the necessary arrangements and came back and did it again the next week. He was not trying to substitute for Edwin, whom no one could substitute for. He was simply being present in the way that he had come to understand presence as something given rather than demanded. They buried Edwin in the small cemetery east of the church in Millhaven, in December ground that was frozen 2 feet down and required considerable effort to open. The congregation came, and the neighbors came, and Reverend Brooks spoke with the genuine feeling of a man who had known Edwin Slater as a person and not just a parishioner. And afterward people came to the homestead and brought food and sat with Margaret and told stories about Edwin, the funny ones and the impressive ones, and the ones that were simply illustrative of who he had been. Garrett Albright did not come. No one remarked on his absence. Winter settled over the homestead with the particular gravity of a Great Plains winter, the snow horizontal and the wind coming out of the northwest, with nothing to stop it for 300 miles. The temperatures dropping to the kind of cold that made every task a negotiation with your body. Timothy and Winifred worked through it with the steady practicality that the season demanded, caring for the animals, maintaining the water supply, keeping the house warm, checking the stock twice a day. Margaret was quieter than her ordinary quiet, the grief working in her, but she was also present and functional, and she told Timothy once, on a cold morning in January when they were working in the kitchen together while Winifred slept late, something she needed and was not always willing to take, that she was glad he had come back. "I was not entirely generous about your return," she said. "In the beginning. You had reason to be cautious," he said. "I was watching my daughter," Margaret said. "She had waited a long time, and I did not want to see her hurt. But I watched you, and I understand now why she did. She was making bread, and she punched the dough with a practiced motion." "Edwin liked you from the first day. He was good to me," Timothy said. "He was," she said. "He was good in the way that good men are without needing it noticed." The baby came in March, a boy, born on a Wednesday afternoon in the strong light of a late winter day with the snow still on the ground but the sky doing something different, something that suggested spring was being considered. The doctor from Millhaven came in time, having ridden through a light snowfall, and Margaret was present, and Timothy paced the front room for 2 hours in a state of managed anxiety until he heard the sound that is the first sound, the one that changes everything, coming from the bedroom. The doctor opened the door and said that everyone was well. Timothy went in and sat beside Winifred, who was holding the baby and was tired in the particular total way of a woman who has just done the hardest physical work there is, and she looked up at him with an exhausted, full, open expression that he had never seen on her face before. "He is perfectly formed," she said. Timothy looked at the small face, the eyes closed, the impossibly small hands, the shock of dark hair. "He is," he said. "He looks like you. He looks like a very small person who is not sure about being outside yet," Winifred said, and Timothy laughed and she laughed, quietly, carefully, and the baby made a sound at the disturbance. They named him Edwin Timothy Winslow, which was the right name for a number of reasons, all of which were clear. Spring came behind the baby with the enthusiasm of a Nebraska spring that has been postponed too long, everything happening at once. The grass going from brown to green in what felt like a week, the creek rising with snowmelt, the birds arriving from the south, the soil warming and becoming workable. Timothy planted the east field with corn and the west field with wheat, working from before dawn to after dusk on the planting days, coming in at night with his back telling him things about the day that he was happy to hear because they were the reports of useful labor. Young Edwin was a good baby. by which is meant a baby who cried when he needed something, and was otherwise present and alert and interested, lying on his back in the kitchen basket, watching the movements of the room with the profound concentration of a person, encountering a great deal of new information. Margaret had opinions about his care that were informed by experience and were mostly correct. Winifred managed the shift from sleeping through the night to not sleeping through the night with the same pragmatic efficiency she brought to every other challenge, and Timothy took the early morning wakings when he could, walking the baby around the front room in the dark while Winifred slept, the small weight of him against his shoulder, the sounds of the Nebraska pre-dawn around the house. In those early morning hours, walking in the dark with Edwin against his shoulder, Timothy thought about the letter in his boot. He had taken it out some weeks after arriving at the homestead and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, which was where he kept the things he valued most. He had shown it to Winifred one evening not long after they were engaged, and she had read her own words in the lamplight with an expression that he could not quite read, something layered. "I meant every word," she said. "I know," he said. "I could tell, that's why I kept it. I used to wonder after I sent it," she said, "whether it was too much, too direct." "It was exactly enough," he said. "It was exactly what I needed." She had given the letter back to him, and he had returned it to the coat pocket, and it was there still, the paper softer now than ever, worn to almost nothing along the creases, but intact. He thought he would keep it forever. He thought it was the most important document he had ever held, more important than any contract or deed, because it was the document that had connected him to where he was, had given him a fixed point to navigate by through 2 years of hard country. The summer of 1879 was generous, the rains coming at the right times, the sun coming at the right times, the corn growing as corn will when everything cooperates, tall and strong and green, the wheat ripening gold in the west field, the cattle on the south pasture fat and healthy. Timothy hired a hand for the harvest, a young man named James who had recently come from Missouri looking for work, and whom he paid fairly and housed in the room off the barn where he himself had once slept. He and Winifred sat on the porch in the evenings again, but now with young Edwin between them, in the cradle that Timothy had built over the winter from ash wood, the baby growing into a person with opinions and a particular laugh that seemed too large for someone so small. Margaret sat with them sometimes, or went inside to read, or walked the creek path in the evening light, and Timothy had the sense that she was making room for them, giving them the space of the evening as a kind of gift, which it was. They had the conversations that people have when they are building something together and have time to talk about what they are building. The produce from Winifred's expanded kitchen garden had sold well at the Millhaven market through the summer, an initiative she had started in June, and that had proved, as she had anticipated, a useful secondary income. They talked about expanding it further, about the possibility of building a small root cellar for winter storage, about the long-term soil management that Edwin had practiced and that she wanted to continue and improve on. Timothy talked about horses. He had been thinking about it over the months, and he thought there was an opportunity in the area for careful horse breeding, a step up from the ordinary stock that most operations ran, horses bred for specific working purposes and sold to ranches and freighters and the expanding railroad operations. He had the eye for it, developed over years of working with horses across the West, and he had the knowledge. It would take capital and time, but the homestead had enough land, and the time was available. Winifred listened to this idea with the careful attention she brought to everything and asked questions that revealed she had been thinking along similar lines without exactly the same conclusion. By the end of the conversation, they had something better than either plan separately, and she said, "We should write it out properly." And he said, "Yes." And she went inside and came back with paper and a pen, and they wrote it out together on the porch in the warm dark with the fireflies over the creek and young Edwin asleep in his cradle. He was happy. He knew he was happy because he recognized it not as an elevated feeling but as a ground state, the ordinary condition of his days, the thing that was there when nothing particular was happening. He thought about the years of driving cattle and drifting from job to job and sleeping under the open sky, and he did not regret any of it except in the specific area of time lost that could not be recovered, the 2 years he should have been here, the worries he could have prevented, the work he could have shared. But the road had made him what he was, had built the skills and the steadiness and the understanding of hard country that he brought to this life, and he thought Edwin Slater would have said something about that, about how a man's path was the thing that prepared him for the destination, even when the path was longer than it needed to be. The harvest was good. They brought in more corn than the previous year and more wheat, and the cattle sold well in the fall, and by November Timothy's accounting showed that the homestead was, for the first time in several years, solidly solvent. Not prosperous by any large measure, but stable, the debt to the Omaha Bank on schedule and reducing, the winter supplies full, the stock healthy, the equipment in repair. He told Winifred the numbers at the kitchen table one evening after supper, laying out the ledger he had been keeping since spring, and she went through it carefully, the way she went through everything, and when she looked up her expression was the one he had learned to recognize as the one she wore when things were going as she had believed they could. "We did this," she said. "We did," he said. "Together," she said, and it was not a question. "Together," he confirmed. She closed the ledger and pushed it across the table and reached over and covered his hand with hers, and they sat for a moment in the kitchen with the lamp burning, and the sound of the baby sleeping in the next room, and the sound of the Nebraska night around the house. In the spring of 1880, the first foal was born from the breeding program Timothy had begun with 2 mares purchased carefully over the winter, a bay colt of exceptional conformation that 3 ranchers from the South County expressed interest in before he was weaned. Timothy sold him at a price that covered the cost of both mares and left something over, and he and Winifred stood at the fence watching the sale with the particular satisfaction of people who have had an idea and seen it become real. "First of many," she said. "First of many," he agreed. Winifred told him about the second child in the summer of that year, the same way she had told him about the first, matter-of-factly and with that private brightness in her eyes. This time he did not pick her up, having learned from the first time that this was not what she wanted. He took her hands instead and looked at her and said that he was glad, and she said she was too, and they went back to what they had been doing, which was planting the fall garden, and worked side by side in the September afternoon with the knowledge of the new thing between them. The second child was a girl, born in February, and they named her Margaret Ann, and the older Margaret cried when she heard the name, quietly and without self-consciousness, and hugged Winifred for a long time. Young Edwin, now nearly 2 and walking with the determined instability of a person recently convinced that 2 legs are sufficient, was introduced to his sister with a solemnity appropriate to the occasion, and then immediately went back to his primary interest, which was a wooden horse Timothy had carved for him over the winter. The years began to accumulate in the way that good years do, not dramatically but substantially, each one built on the last, the homestead growing and changing and improving, the children growing, the horses becoming a recognized operation in the county, the kitchen garden producing through a network that now included 3 other farms in a cooperative arrangement that Winifred had organized, and that the county agricultural extension, newly established in Columbus, had written them a letter about requesting information on how it worked. Margaret Slater lived with them for 3 more years before she decided, at the age of 62, that she wanted to go to Ohio to visit her sister, whom she had not seen in 20 years, and that she might stay a while. She left on a bright spring day, Timothy driving her to the Millhaven depot in the wagon, Winifred and the 2 children on the porch to see her off, and Margaret hugged each of them with the thoroughness of a woman who knows she is loved and knows she is leaving something good behind. She wrote from Ohio. She stayed for the winter and came back in the spring, and then went again the following fall. And after a few years she was spending roughly half the year in each place, which suited everyone, and the room that had been hers was kept ready for her always. Harold Cutter wrote to Winifred in the fall of 1881 with the news that the Western Land and Settlement Company had been dissolved by its Chicago investors following a series of legal challenges in 3 other states, similar procedural defects apparently having been found in Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri. Garrett Albright had closed the feed store and moved away, destination unknown. Hatch at the post office had this last piece of information and delivered it to Timothy with the neutrality of a man who felt no particular emotion about the departure of a person who had not been an asset to the community. Timothy told Winifred over supper. She nodded. "Good," she said. "That's all." "What else should I feel?" she said. "He did what he did and it came to nothing. We are here and the homestead is ours. There's nothing further to feel about it." He thought about this. She was right in the way she was often right. There was nothing further to feel. The account was closed. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "No," he said. "There's nothing further to feel about that. There's quite a lot further to feel about everything else." She turned her hand over under his and held it properly. "Yes," she said, "everything else." They had been married for almost 3 years. Young Edwin was 2.5 and Margaret Ann was 6 months, and the horses were a recognized enterprise, and the kitchen garden cooperative had become something that people in the county talked about at the agricultural meetings in Columbus, and the south fence was in good repair and the barn roof had been replaced, and the east field had produced 3 good harvests, and the soil was improving, as Winifred had intended, year by year. He thought about the letter. He kept it still in the inside pocket of his coat, which he hung each evening on the peg by the kitchen door. Sometimes he took it out and held it without unfolding it, feeling the softness of the paper, the deep-worn creases. It had survived everything: 2 years of boot and trail and dust and rain and the Texas Panhandle and the Kansas Plain and the Missouri Road. It had survived being read in lamplight in rooms from Fort Worth to Wichita to the boarding house in Lincoln on the night before he rode to Millhaven. It had survived being carried close to him through everything. He thought he would tell his children about it someday, when they were old enough to understand. He would tell them that their mother had written a letter that told him she was going to be where she said she would be, and that he had carried that letter for a 1.5 years in the bottom of his boot, and that when he had finally come back to where she was, she had been exactly where she said, unchanged in the essential thing, waiting not passively but fully, living her life and fighting her battles and being herself, and that this was the most important thing he had ever seen a person do. He would tell them that the letter was why he had come back, and that she was why he had stayed. He would tell them that love, in his experience, was not a single moment but an accumulation of moments: the letter in the boot, and the trip to Columbus, and the fence work, and the kitchen garden, and the mornings before dawn walking with a baby on his shoulder, and the evenings on the porch with the fireflies over the creek. It was all of it. It was the working alongside, and the talking in the dusk, and the honesty that went both ways without softening itself into something easier. He would tell them that it was worth waiting for, and worth working for, and worth riding a hard country for 2 years and then coming back for. On a warm evening in August of 1881, Timothy Winslow sat on the porch of the Slater homestead, which was now also his homestead, which would someday be his children's homestead, and watched the fireflies rise over the creek, and his wife was beside him, and his son was asleep inside, and his daughter was asleep, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the corn was high in the east field, and the grass moved in the evening wind the way it always moved, like something breathing. And the sky overhead was the enormous Nebraska sky full of stars. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out the letter. He held it in his hands, and Winifred watched him, knowing what it was. She had seen it before. She knew what it meant. He did not unfold it. He held it, the soft, worn paper, the weight of it, and then he looked at her. She was still where she said she would be, he said. Winifred looked at him with the warm, direct eyes he had fallen in love with across a fence 3 years ago, and she said, she was. He put the letter carefully back in his pocket. They sat on the porch in the summer dark, the fireflies coming up from the creek in their small lights, the meadowlarks quiet now but the night birds beginning, the horses shifting in the barn in their warm and peaceful ways, the children sleeping the sound sleep of the young and well-loved, and the Nebraska sky vast and bright above all of it. He took her hand. She held it. They sat there a long time in no hurry at all, because they were exactly where they were supposed to be,